Welcome to Moonlight Myths, where soothing stories guide you gently into sleep. I'm so glad you're here. If you enjoy this journey, I'd love for you to like and subscribe so we can share many more peaceful nights together. Now, settle in, let yourself relax, and allow the story to carry you into the sweetest dreams. Before we begin, it's important to understand that the Elioud come from a small collection of ancient Jewish texts outside the biblical canon. What we know about them is limited, fragmented, and often filtered through later interpretation. Some details come directly from texts like 1 Enoch and Jubilees, while others reflect how different cultures, scholars, and storytellers have tried to make sense of those texts over time. This video does not claim to present settled doctrine or historical certainty. Instead, it explores the Elioud as they appear in ancient tradition, and how their story has been remembered, forgotten, and reimagined across the centuries. There are names that echo through history with such force that they become part of our collective memory. Giants, Titans, Nephilim. These words carry weight, conjuring images of beings that straddled the line between the mortal and the divine. But there are other names, quieter names, that have slipped through the cracks of time, whispered only in the margins of ancient texts, known only to those who seek them out with patience and care. The Elioud are one such name. In the vast tapestry of ancient Jewish literature, woven with stories of angels and patriarchs, of floods and covenants, the Elioud occupy a space that is remarkably small. They are not celebrated. They are not feared in the way their predecessors were. They simply exist, preserved in fragments, mentioned in passing, as if the authors themselves were uncertain whether these beings warranted more than a footnote in the grand narrative of creation. If you were to open the canonical Hebrew Bible, the Torah, the books of the prophets, the writings, and search for the Elioud, you would find nothing. Not a single verse. Not even a fleeting reference. The pages that have shaped 3 major world religions, that have been copied and translated and studied for thousands of years, contain no mention of them whatsoever. It is as if they were deliberately omitted, or perhaps forgotten before the canon was ever set. This absence is striking. In a text that catalogues genealogies with meticulous care, that remembers the names of obscure kings and forgotten tribes, the Elioud are nowhere to be found. They exist outside the official record, dwelling in that shadowy realm of tradition and interpretation that surrounds every sacred text. So where, then, do we find them? The knowledge we possess of the Elioud comes from a different source entirely, a small cluster of texts composed during what scholars call the Second Temple period. This was a time of great creativity in Jewish thought, spanning roughly from the 5th century before the Common Era to the 1st century of the Common Era. It was an era when new ideas about angels and demons, about the structure of heaven and the fate of souls, were being explored and debated. Writers were producing works that expanded upon the stories of Genesis, filling in gaps, asking questions that the older texts had left unanswered. These Second Temple writings were not considered scripture by most Jewish communities, and they would later be excluded from the Protestant canon of the Bible. But for the people who wrote them and read them, they carried authority. They offered explanations. They provided a framework for understanding the mysteries of creation and the nature of evil in the world. It is in these texts, works like the Book of Enoch, the Book of Jubilees, and others, that the Elioud make their appearance. Even there, however, they are not given center stage. They emerge in brief mentions, in genealogies, in lists that catalog the offspring of forbidden unions. They are present, but barely so. For most people today, even those with a deep interest in biblical literature and ancient mythology, the Elioud remain unknown. The name itself is unfamiliar, difficult to pronounce, carrying none of the immediate recognition of their more famous kin. The average reader might know about the Nephilim, those giants who walked the earth before the flood, the offspring of the sons of God and the daughters of men. These figures have captured imaginations for millennia, appearing in art and literature, in films and games, their story retold and reimagined countless times. But the Elioud? Most people encounter this term only after they have already gone down a particular path of inquiry. Perhaps they have been studying the Nephilim and stumbled across a reference in a commentary. Perhaps they have been reading the Book of Enoch and paused at an unusual word. The discovery of the Elioud is rarely a beginning. it is almost always a continuation of a journey that started elsewhere. Even among scholars, those who dedicate their lives to the study of ancient texts and traditions, the Elioud receive remarkably little attention. Academic papers are written about the Nephilim, about the Watchers, about the complex angelology of Second Temple Judaism. Entire books are devoted to understanding the mythology of giants in the ancient Near East. But the Elioud are mentioned in passing, if at all. They are a footnote to a footnote, a minor detail in a larger story that itself occupies only a small corner of biblical scholarship. Why this neglect? Perhaps it is because the sources that mention them are so sparse. Perhaps it is because they seem to be merely an echo of the Nephilim, not distinct enough to warrant separate study. Or perhaps it is because they represent something uncomfortable, a reminder of just how much mythology and speculation surrounded the biblical text in ancient times, how many stories were being told that never made it into the official canon. This brings us to an important realization about the Elioud. Much of what is said about them today does not come from direct description in ancient texts, but from interpretation. Scholars and enthusiasts have taken the few brief mentions that exist and built upon them, inferring details, constructing narratives, filling in the vast empty spaces with educated guesses and creative imagination. When you read about the Elioud in modern sources, you are often reading someone's attempt to make sense of fragmented evidence. You are seeing the product of centuries of tradition, of medieval commentaries, of contemporary theories about how different ancient texts relate to one another. The line between what the ancients actually wrote and what later readers have inferred is not always clear. This is not to say that such interpretation is without value. On the contrary, the process of interpretation is how traditions survive and evolve. Every generation looks at ancient texts through the lens of its own questions and concerns, finding new meanings, making new connections. The Elioud, precisely because they are so obscure, become a kind of mirror, reflecting back our own curiosity about origins, about the mixing of divine and human, about what was lost in the great catastrophe of the flood. But we must approach them with humility, acknowledging that we are building on a foundation that is remarkably thin. We are trying to reconstruct beings who were barely recorded in the first place, whose nature and fate were perhaps uncertain, even to those who first wrote them down. In the chapters that follow, we will trace what can be known about the Elioud, examining the texts that mention them, exploring the traditions that preserved their memory, considering what role they played in the ancient imagination. We will move slowly through this material, not because there is an overwhelming abundance of it, but because what little exists deserves careful attention. The story of the Elioud is a story about what happens at the margins of mythology, in those spaces where the light of official history does not quite reach. It is a story about forgotten names and half-remembered beings, about the countless tales that once circulated in ancient communities but never achieved the status of scripture. It is a reminder that for every story that survives, there are dozens that fade into obscurity, leaving behind only traces, only whispers, only questions without clear answers. And so we begin with that forgotten name, spoken in texts that most people have never read, referring to beings that most people have never heard of. We begin with the Elioud, dwelling in the shadows of greater giants, waiting patiently across the centuries for someone to notice them, to ask about them, to wonder what their existence might mean. Before the flood came and washed the ancient world away, before the waters rose and covered the mountains and drowned the wickedness that had spread across the earth, there were beings whose nature was mixed, whose bloodlines were tangled between heaven and earth. The most famous of these were the Nephilim, but they were not the only ones. There were also the Elioud, whose name has been all but forgotten, whose story has been told only in fragments, whose place in the grand narrative remains uncertain even now. This is their story, or at least as much of it as we can piece together from the scattered remains of ancient testimony. It is a story that begins not with certainty but with obscurity, not with clear answers but with questions that may never be fully resolved. It is a story that invites us to look more closely at the texts we think we know, to search for what has been overlooked, to listen for voices that have been speaking all along, just too quietly for most to hear. To understand the Elioud, we must first understand the lineage from which they descended, a chain of beings whose existence began with a transgression so profound that it would reshape the ancient world and, according to tradition, necessitate the great flood itself. The story begins not on earth, but in heaven. In the ancient Enochic tradition, that body of literature centered around the patriarch Enoch, who walked with God and was taken up without tasting death, there is a detailed account of what happened before the flood. This tradition, preserved primarily in the Book of Enoch, tells of events that the canonical Genesis only hints at, expanding a few cryptic verses into an elaborate narrative of cosmic rebellion and its consequences. At the heart of this narrative are the Watchers. These were angels, beings of heaven assigned to watch over humanity in its early days. Their name itself speaks to their purpose. They were observers, guardians, perhaps teachers. They existed in that liminal space between the divine realm and the mortal world, able to perceive both, tasked with maintaining some form of oversight as humanity multiplied across the face of the earth. But the Watchers did not remain mere observers. According to the tradition, 200 of these angels made a fateful decision. They looked upon the daughters of men, the human women who walked the earth, and found them beautiful. Desire stirred in beings who should have been beyond such earthly passions. And rather than turning away, rather than maintaining the boundary that separated heaven from earth, they chose to cross it. The texts describe this as a deliberate act, not an accident or a moment of weakness. The Watchers gathered on Mount Hermon, and there they made a pact. They bound themselves to one another with oaths, knowing that what they were about to do was forbidden, knowing that there would be consequences. But desire and curiosity proved stronger than obedience, and they descended. They took human women as wives. This union, angels with humans, the divine mixing with the mortal, was a violation of the natural order. It was not simply a matter of impropriety or breaking a rule. It was a fundamental transgression against the structure of creation itself, a blurring of boundaries that were meant to remain distinct. Heaven and earth were separate realms, and beings from one were not meant to intermingle with the other in this way. But intermingle they did, and from these unions came offspring. The children born of Watchers and human women were not ordinary children. They could not be. They carried within them a mixture of natures, a combination of the celestial and the terrestrial that manifested in their very bodies. These offspring grew to enormous size, becoming giants who towered over ordinary humans. They possessed strength beyond mortal limits, appetites that could not be satisfied by normal means, and a capacity for violence that would eventually threaten all life on earth. These beings are the ones most commonly identified as the Nephilim. The word Nephilim appears in Genesis, in that brief and enigmatic passage that speaks of the sons of God taking the daughters of men. The text says that the Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, and that they were the mighty men of old, men of renown. But Genesis provides no further explanation, leaving readers across the centuries to wonder, who exactly were these beings? Where did they come from? What happened to them? The Enochic tradition provides an answer, or at least one version of an answer. The Nephilim were the direct offspring of the Watchers, the first generation of hybrids, carrying the strongest concentration of angelic blood. They were beings of immense power and terrible hunger, and their presence on earth was a catastrophe. But the chain did not end there. The Nephilim themselves had offspring. They reproduced, either with human women or perhaps among themselves. The texts are not always clear on this point. And from the Nephilim came another generation, further removed from the original angelic source, carrying a more diluted form of that celestial inheritance. These were the Elioud. This is the crucial distinction that we must understand. The Elioud are not simply another name for the Nephilim. They are not the same beings. They come after, not alongside. They are descendants, not direct offspring of the Watchers. While the Nephilim represent the first generation of angel-human hybrids, the Elioud represent a second generation, or possibly even a third, depending on how the genealogy is traced. This positioning is important. It tells us something about how ancient writers conceived of these beings and their place in the cosmic order. The Elioud were further removed from the original transgression, carrying angelic ancestry but in a weakened, diluted form. They were still extraordinary by human standards, still giants, still possessing unusual abilities, but they were not as powerful as the Nephilim who came before them. Think of it as a kind of fading echo. The Watchers were pure angelic beings. Their children, the Nephilim, were half angelic, carrying immense power but also mortality. The children of the Nephilim, the Elioud, were perhaps a quarter angelic, or even less, their divine heritage attenuated with each generation, growing fainter, more distant from its source. This concept of generational dilution appears in various ancient traditions. It reflects an understanding that the mixing of different kinds of beings produces offspring that gradually revert toward one nature or the other. In this case, with each generation, the Elioud would have become more human and less angelic, their extraordinary characteristics diminishing over time. Some texts make this generational sequence even more explicit, describing not just two but three distinct groups. First came the giants, a term used sometimes interchangeably with Nephilim but occasionally distinguished from them. Then came the Nephilim proper. And finally came the Elioud, the last link in the chain, the final generation before the flood washed everything away. This threefold division suggests a more complex genealogy than the simple binary of angel and human. It hints at a process of transformation over multiple generations, as angelic characteristics were gradually bred out and human characteristics reasserted themselves. By the time we reach the Elioud, we are looking at beings who are mostly human but who still carry traces, perhaps faint traces, of their supernatural origins. The texts that mention this sequence do so with a kind of calm systematicity, as if cataloging different species of beings that once existed. There is a taxonomic quality to these descriptions, a desire to organize and classify the various forms of life that populated the antediluvian world. The Watchers occupy one category, the Nephilim another, the Elioud a third. Each has their place in the hierarchy, their role in the story. This careful delineation serves several purposes. It helps explain the diversity of giant traditions found across different cultures. Perhaps different peoples encountered different generations of these beings and told different stories about them. It also provides a more gradual transition from the fully angelic to the fully human, avoiding the stark either-or that a single generation of hybrids would represent. But more than that, this generational framework adds depth to the tragedy of the flood narrative. By the time God decides to send the deluge, the earth is populated not just by wicked humans and their angelic corruptors, but by multiple generations of hybrid beings, by a whole ecology of the unnatural. The Nephilim have had time to reproduce. Their children, the Elioud, have grown to maturity. Perhaps there are even further generations beyond the Elioud, beings who are mostly human but who still carry that cursed bloodline within them. The world before the flood, in this understanding, is not simply wicked but corrupted at a fundamental level. The boundaries between kinds have been so thoroughly violated that the very fabric of creation has been compromised. It is not enough to punish the original transgressors, the Watchers themselves. Their legacy has spread too far, taken root too deeply. The offspring of the Nephilim walk the earth. The Elioud represent a bloodline that should never have existed, and their presence is a constant reminder of the original transgression that set everything in motion. This is why, according to the tradition, such drastic measures became necessary. This is why water had to cover the mountains, why every living thing had to be destroyed, why only Noah and his family, whose bloodline was pure, untainted by angelic intermixture, were preserved in the ark. The corruption had gone too deep. The chain of hybrid beings had extended too far. The only solution was to start again, to wipe the slate clean and begin anew. The Elioud, then, are not just another species of giant. They are a marker of how far the corruption had spread, how many generations had passed since the Watchers first descended. They represent the persistence of that original sin, the way a single transgression can propagate forward through time, creating consequences that reach far beyond the initial act. In the genealogical chain that leads from heaven to earth, from angel to human, the Elioud occupy a middle position. They are neither one thing nor the other, but something in between, beings defined by mixture, by inheritance, by the legacy of choices made generations before they were born. They did not choose to be what they were. They were born into a nature that was fundamentally problematic, fundamentally at odds with the created order. This raises questions, of course, questions about responsibility and justice. If the Elioud were merely descendants, born into their hybrid nature through no fault of their own, were they culpable for the sins of their forebears? Did they deserve to perish in the flood along with everything else? Or were they simply casualties of a corruption that began before they existed? The texts do not spend much time wrestling with these moral complexities. The focus is on establishing the facts of the lineage, on documenting what existed and what came from what. But for the reader, these questions linger. The Elioud become, in a way, tragic figures, beings whose very existence was a problem, whose birth was a continuation of an ancient crime, but who may have had no more choice in the matter than any other child born into difficult circumstances. Understanding this chain of beings, watchers to Nephilim to Elioud, is essential for grasping the full scope of what the ancient texts are describing. This is not a simple story of angels and humans. It is a multi-generational saga of corruption and consequence, of boundaries broken and the long shadow of those breakings. Each link in the chain represents another step away from the original order, another generation living with the legacy of what the Watchers began. And at the end of that chain, just before the waters rose, were the Elioud, the last generation, the fading echo of angelic power, the final iteration of a lineage that should never have been. They stood on the earth that their ancestors had corrupted, carrying within themselves the proof of an ancient transgression, waiting unknowingly for the judgment that was coming, the water that would sweep them all away and leave only memory behind. The world before the flood was not like the world we know. To understand the Elioud and their place in that ancient age, we must first try to imagine what life was like in those distant days, a time so far removed from our own that it exists more in myth than in memory, more in symbol than in historical record. The texts that describe this era paint a picture of a world that had gone profoundly wrong, where the natural order had collapsed and chaos reigned. The Elioud were part of that world. They walked upon that corrupted earth, breathed its air, participated in its violence. And according to the traditions that preserve their memory, they were not merely witnesses to the collapse of the antediluvian age, they were active contributors to it. Like their Nephilim forebears, the Elioud possessed power that far exceeded normal human capacity. Though they were further removed from the angelic source than the first generation of hybrids, they still carried within themselves something that set them apart, that made them formidable and dangerous. The exact nature of this power is not always specified in the ancient texts, but we can infer certain characteristics from what is said about beings of their kind. They were likely larger than ordinary humans, though perhaps not as massive as the Nephilim themselves. Size, in these traditions, often correlates with proximity to the divine source. The closer to angelic ancestry, the greater the physical stature. The Elioud, being further down the genealogical chain, may have been intermediate in size, still giants by human standards but not the towering colossi that the first hybrids were said to be. But size alone does not account for the threat they posed. The texts speak of strength, of appetites, of capabilities that normal humans did not possess. The Elioud would have been warriors of exceptional prowess, beings who could dominate in combat, who could take what they wanted by force, who could impose their will upon those weaker than themselves. And in the world before the flood, might increasingly became right. Strength became the only law that mattered. This brings us to one of the most consistent themes in the descriptions of the Elioud, their association with violence. The antediluvian world, as portrayed in the Enochic tradition and related texts, descended into bloodshed and chaos. The Book of Enoch describes how the Nephilim consumed the resources of humanity, devouring crops and livestock until nothing remained, and then turning to consuming humans themselves. This image of insatiable hunger, of consumption that knows no bounds, characterizes the giants of that age. They took and took until there was nothing left to take. The Elioud, as descendants of the Nephilim, inherited this tendency toward excess and violence. They may not have possessed the full measure of their ancestors' power, but they possessed enough to make them dangerous, enough to allow them to prey upon ordinary humans, enough to contribute to the spiral of corruption that was consuming the world. Violence breeds violence. When beings of superior power use that power without restraint, those around them must either submit or attempt to match force with force. The world of the Elioud was a world where aggression became the norm, where mercy was weakness, where the strong dominated the weak as a matter of course. The moral structure that should have governed human society, concepts of justice, fairness, mutual care, eroded under the constant pressure of might making right. But the violence was not directed only at humans. This is one of the more intriguing aspects of the traditions surrounding the Elioud, the suggestion that conflict existed not just between hybrids and humans, but among the hybrid beings themselves. Different texts and variant accounts describe struggles between giants, between Nephilim, and between the Elioud, internecine conflicts among beings who shared a common, cursed heritage. Why would such conflicts arise? Perhaps for the same reasons that humans fight among themselves: competition for resources, territory, dominance. Perhaps there were hierarchies among the hybrid beings, with the more purely angelic looking down upon the more diluted bloodlines, or vice versa. Perhaps the Elioud, being a later generation, were seen as inferior by the Nephilim, or perhaps they resented the Nephilim for their greater power and sought to challenge them. The texts do not provide detailed narratives of these conflicts, but they hint at a world where violence had become so pervasive that even beings of the same general kind turned against one another. This suggests a complete breakdown of social cohesion, a world where alliance and cooperation had given way to a war of all against all. Trust had evaporated. Community had dissolved. What remained was naked force and the will to dominate. Imagine, for a moment, what daily life might have been like in such a world. Ordinary humans would have lived in constant fear, knowing that beings of immense power walked among them, beings who might at any moment decide to take what they wanted: crops, livestock, land, even human lives. There would have been no reliable protection, no authority capable of restraining the Elioud and their kind. The structures of civilization, law, governance, mutual defense, would have been ineffective against beings who could simply overwhelm any resistance. Communities might have tried to appease the Elioud, offering tribute, surrendering resources in hopes of being left alone. But appeasement is a strategy that works only when the stronger party has some capacity for satisfaction, some point at which their demands are met. If the traditions about insatiable appetites are to be believed, no amount of offering would have been enough. The Elioud, like the Nephilim before them, would have taken and taken until nothing remained. In such an environment, human society would have fractured. Some might have allied themselves with the hybrid beings, serving them in exchange for protection or privilege. Others might have fled to remote regions, trying to escape the reach of the giants. Still others might have banded together in desperate resistance, knowing that death was likely but preferring that to submission. The world would have been a patchwork of fear and desperation, with violence as the constant thread running through everything. And in the midst of this chaos, the Elioud themselves lived their lives, if lived is even the right word for an existence so saturated with conflict and excess. They were born into a world already collapsing, inheritors of a corruption they did not create but which shaped everything they knew. Whatever potential they might have had, whatever they might have become in a different world, was warped by the environment of violence and moral decay that surrounded them. The ancient texts, in their stark and often brutal way, present this as a matter of inevitable consequence. The original transgression of the Watchers set in motion a chain of events that could only end in catastrophe. The birth of the Nephilim corrupted the earth. The birth of the Elioud extended and deepened that corruption. Each generation propagated the problem forward, until the situation became not just bad but unsalvageable. This is one of the darker aspects of these traditions, the sense that the corruption had become self-perpetuating, that it had reached a critical mass beyond which recovery was impossible. The Elioud were not just doing violent things. Their very existence was a form of ongoing violence against the created order. They were beings who should not have been, living proof that the boundaries meant to separate heaven and earth had been breached beyond repair. The texts describe the antediluvian world as a place where wickedness had filled the earth, where every inclination of the human heart was only evil continually. This is more than just a statement about moral behavior. It suggests a fundamental corruption that had infected existence itself. The presence of beings like the Elioud, creatures of mixed nature, born from forbidden unions, perpetuating themselves across generations, was both a symptom and a cause of this corruption. In this understanding, the violence attributed to the Elioud was not merely a matter of individual choices or personal wickedness. It was structural, built into the very fabric of what the world had become. A world that contained such beings could not be other than violent. Their power demanded to be used. Their appetites demanded to be fed. The mixture of natures within them created instability, a restlessness that could not be satisfied by peaceful existence. And so the violence continued, escalating, spreading, until it reached every corner of the earth. The traditions frame this as the reason why divine judgment became inevitable. God looked upon the world and saw that it had become too corrupted to continue, that the experiment of human freedom had produced a result so catastrophic that the only solution was to end it and start again. The flood was not an arbitrary punishment but a necessary cleansing, the only way to erase what had gone wrong and restore the possibility of a proper order. The Elioud, along with the Nephilim and all the other hybrid beings, were marked for destruction not necessarily because of any particular action they had taken, but because their existence itself was incompatible with the world as it was meant to be. They were the living evidence of a transgression that could not be undone, a mixture that could not be unmixed. Their presence ensured that the corruption would continue, that violence would perpetuate itself, that the boundaries between heaven and earth would remain permanently compromised. This is, in many ways, a tragic vision. The Elioud did not choose to be born. They did not decide to be hybrids, to carry angelic ancestry, to possess powers that set them apart and above ordinary humans. They inherited a nature that made them instruments of violence and corruption, and perhaps they had no more ability to resist that nature than a wolf can choose to be an herbivore. They were what they were, and what they were had become incompatible with the continuation of life on Earth. The flood narrative, then, represents the end of these hybrid races. The rising waters did not distinguish between the wicked and the innocent, between those who had actively chosen evil and those who had simply been born into a cursed lineage. Everything that drew breath outside the ark perished. The Nephilim drowned. The Elioud drowned. The humans who had descended into wickedness drowned. The animals caught in the wrong place at the wrong time drowned. When the waters receded and Noah emerged onto a cleansed earth, the world of the Elioud was gone. Whatever they had been, whatever they had done, whatever potential they might have had, all of it was washed away, leaving only the memory preserved in texts that would themselves barely survive the millennia to come. The antediluvian world remains, for us, a distant and alien place. We can read about it in ancient texts, we can try to imagine what life might have been like, but we cannot truly know it. The Elioud walked in that world, part of its violence and its corruption, participants in its final descent into chaos. They were powerful beings, certainly. They were violent beings, almost certainly. They contributed to the moral collapse that made judgment inevitable. But they were also, in the end, victims of a fate set in motion before they were born, casualties of a transgression they did not commit, swept away by waters that rose to erase every trace of the world they had known. In 40 days and 40 nights, everything they were ceased to be, and the world began again without them. Every story that survives from the ancient world survives because someone chose to write it down, and then someone else chose to copy it, and then another person chose to preserve that copy. The story of the Elioud is no exception. These beings, so obscure that most people have never heard of them, exist in our awareness only because a small number of ancient texts mention them, and those texts managed, against considerable odds, to survive the passage of more than 2,000 years. To understand the Elioud, we must turn our attention to these texts themselves, to examine where and how the name appears, what context surrounds it, and how different traditions preserved slightly different versions of the same basic story. This is the work of grounding myth in history, of tracing ideas back to their documentary sources, of acknowledging that everything we know about these beings comes filtered through the particular perspectives and languages of ancient writers. The most explicit mention of the Elioud appears in the Book of Enoch, specifically in a Greek passage that names them as a distinct generation in the sequence of hybrid beings. The Book of Enoch is itself a complex document with a complicated history. It is not a single unified text but rather a collection of several different works, composed at different times, reflecting different concerns and perspectives, all woven together under the authority of Enoch's name. The earliest sections likely date to the 3rd century before the Common Era, while later portions were added over the following centuries. The book was widely read in certain Jewish communities and was quoted as authoritative by some early Christian writers, but it was eventually excluded from most biblical canons and survived primarily in Ethiopic translation. However, portions of Enoch were also preserved in Greek, and it is in these Greek manuscripts that we find the clearest reference to the Elioud. The passage describes the sequence of generations descending from the Watchers, and it explicitly names the Elioud as the final generation in this chain. The Greek text uses a specific term, transliterated as Elioud, that distinguishes these beings from the Nephilim who came before them. This is significant because it gives us a definite textual anchor, a place where we can point and say, here, in this specific passage, in this specific language, the Elioud are named and positioned within a genealogical framework. It moves them from the realm of vague tradition into the realm of documented testimony, however obscure that documentation might be. The Greek passage is brief, offering no detailed description of the Elioud beyond their place in the sequence. It does not tell us what they looked like, how they behaved in detail, or what happened to them specifically. But it does confirm that, in at least one strand of ancient Jewish tradition, the Elioud were understood as a distinct category of being, worthy of being named and differentiated from the giants and Nephilim. But the Book of Enoch is not the only text that preserves memory of the Elioud. The Book of Jubilees, another important work from the Second Temple period, presents a similar but slightly different version of the same tradition. Jubilees is sometimes called Little Genesis because it retells the stories from Genesis with additional details, expansions, and interpretations. It was composed in Hebrew, probably in the 2nd century before the Common Era, and was considered authoritative by certain Jewish communities, including the group at Qumran who produced the Dead Sea Scrolls. In Jubilees, the tradition of hybrid generations appears, but the terminology is slightly different. Instead of Elioud, some versions of the text use a variant form that scholars have rendered as Eljo, or similar transliterations. This variation is not surprising. Ancient texts were copied by hand, and copyists sometimes made errors, sometimes used alternative spellings, sometimes translated terms differently depending on their own understanding and linguistic background. What matters is not the exact spelling but the underlying concept. Jubilees, like Enoch, preserves a tradition of multiple generations of hybrid beings, with the later generations distinct from the first. Whether called Elioud or Eljo or something else, these beings occupy the same conceptual space, descendants of the Nephilim, further removed from the angelic source, part of the corrupted world that necessitated the flood. The existence of this tradition in both Enoch and Jubilees tells us something important. This was not an isolated idea, not something that appeared in a single text and nowhere else. It circulated. Different writers knew about it and incorporated it into their retellings of ancient history. There was, in certain circles at least, a shared understanding that the pre-flood world contained not just one kind of hybrid being but several, arranged in a generational sequence. Our knowledge of these texts, and therefore of the Elioud tradition, was dramatically enhanced by one of the most important archaeological discoveries of the 20th century, the Dead Sea Scrolls. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, Bedouin shepherds and archaeologists discovered a cache of ancient manuscripts in caves near Qumran, on the northwestern shore of the Dead Sea. These scrolls, dating from roughly the 3rd century before the Common Era to the 1st century of the Common Era, contained portions of biblical books, commentaries, hymns, community rules, and copies of various other Jewish texts, including fragments of both Enoch and Jubilees. The Qumran community, whoever they were, and debate continues about their exact identity and relationship to various Jewish groups of the period, clearly valued these texts about angelic transgression and hybrid beings. They copied them, studied them, preserved them in their library. Among the fragments recovered from the caves were pieces that confirmed the sequence of hybrid generations, providing physical evidence that this tradition was not a later invention but something that circulated in Jewish circles during the last centuries before the Common Era. These fragments are small, often frustratingly incomplete. A line here, a phrase there, sometimes just a few words that happen to include a key term. But even in their fragmentary state, they serve as witnesses to a living tradition, proof that people were reading and thinking about these stories, that the Elioud and their kind were part of the conceptual landscape of at least some ancient Jewish communities. The fact that copies of these texts were found at Qumran tells us that they were important to the people who lived there. They were not considered marginal or heretical but valuable, worthy of the considerable time and expense required to produce manuscript copies. The traditions about watchers, Nephilim, and Elioud spoke to concerns that mattered to these communities. Questions about the origin of evil, about the mixing of different orders of being, about how the world had gone wrong and what it would take to set it right. These writings show the Elioud tradition circulating specifically in Jewish apocalyptic circles, groups that were concerned with divine judgment, with cosmic conflict, with the revelation of hidden knowledge about the structure of reality and the course of history. Apocalyptic literature tends to be interested in boundaries and their transgression, in the struggle between order and chaos, in the expectation that the current corrupt age will soon give way to a new creation. The story of the Elioud fit naturally into this worldview, serving as an example of how thoroughly the old world had been corrupted and why such radical divine intervention had been necessary. There is also another text that deserves mention, even though its relationship to the Elioud tradition is less clear: the Book of Giants. The Book of Giants is known from fragments found among the Dead Sea Scrolls and from later versions preserved in Manichaean sources. It tells stories about the giant offspring of the Watchers, their deeds, their dreams, their fate. The fragmentary nature of what survives makes it difficult to reconstruct the full narrative, but what remains is evocative and strange, describing a world of enormous beings engaged in violence and corruption, eventually destroyed by the flood. The Book of Giants does not explicitly use the term Elioud in the fragments that have been recovered, or if it does, that portion has not survived. However, the conceptual overlap is significant. The book clearly deals with the same tradition of hybrid generations, the same world of giants and corruption, the same ultimate judgment. It is possible, though we cannot be certain, that the beings described in the Book of Giants include what other texts call the Elioud, even if they are not named as such. This raises an interesting question about ancient textual traditions. How much did different texts influence each other? Did the authors of Enoch, Jubilees, and the Book of Giants know each other's works? Were they drawing on common oral traditions? Were there other texts, now lost, that also told these stories? The fragments we possess suggest a rich ecosystem of overlapping traditions, with different writers emphasizing different aspects, using different terminology, but working within a shared conceptual framework. What we can say with confidence is that the tradition of multiple generations of hybrid beings was well established in certain streams of Jewish thought during the last few centuries before the Common Era. It was not mainstream. These texts were not included in what became the Hebrew Bible, and many Jewish communities did not regard them as authoritative. But in apocalyptic and sectarian circles, these stories mattered. They provided a framework for understanding the problem of evil, the origin of corruption, the necessity of judgment. The texts that preserved the memory of the Elioud are, in some ways, as obscure as the beings they describe. Most people have never read the Book of Enoch or the Book of Jubilees. These works exist on the margins of biblical literature, known primarily to specialists and those with particular interest in Jewish apocalyptic traditions. The Dead Sea Scrolls brought them to wider attention in the modern era, but they remain far less familiar than the canonical scriptures. And yet, for those who do encounter these texts, they open a window into a different way of imagining the ancient world, a different way of thinking about the relationship between heaven and earth, human and divine. The Elioud, named in a Greek passage, appearing in variant form in Jubilees, confirmed by fragments from Qumran, possibly present in the Book of Giants. These beings represent a strand of tradition that flourished for a time and then faded, preserved in texts that themselves barely survived. When we read about the Elioud today, we are reading across an immense distance, not just in time but in culture, language, and worldview. The people who wrote these texts lived in a world very different from ours, with different assumptions about how reality worked, different ways of understanding causation and divine action. They were not writing history in the modern sense, not attempting to document events with scientific precision. They were theologizing, mythologizing, trying to make sense of ancient traditions and present realities by weaving them together into coherent narratives. The texts that preserved the Elioud are products of this process, documents that blend tradition and innovation, that take old stories and elaborate on them, that use mythological figures to address contemporary concerns. They are not simple or straightforward. They contain contradictions, obscurities, passages that defy easy interpretation. But they are also windows into vanished worlds, both the world they describe and the world of their authors, and for that reason alone, they deserve our attention. These manuscripts, copied by hand on parchment or papyrus, hidden in caves or passed down through communities, translated from Hebrew to Greek to Ethiopic and other languages, fragmentary and disputed, these are the vessels that carried the memory of the Elioud forward through time. Without them, we would know nothing. The name would have been lost entirely, another detail erased by the passage of centuries. But they survived. Not completely, not perfectly, but survived nonetheless. And because they survived, we can still speak about the Elioud, can still puzzle over their place in ancient cosmology, can still trace the contours of traditions that once mattered deeply to people who are now themselves dust and memory. The texts remain, witnesses to what people once believed, evidence of stories that once circulated, monuments to the human impulse to remember and record, to preserve meaning against the erosion of time. There is a particular kind of forgetting that happens not through accident or neglect, but through deliberate choice. It is the forgetting that comes when a community decides that certain stories no longer serve, that certain ideas have become problematic, that certain texts should not be read or taught or preserved with the same care as others. This is the kind of forgetting that claimed the Elioud, not a gradual fading from memory, but an active process of exclusion and rejection that eventually left them stranded in obscurity. The texts that mentioned the Elioud, the Book of Enoch, the Book of Jubilees, and related works, once circulated widely in certain Jewish communities. They were read, copied, studied, quoted as authorities on matters of cosmology and history. The Dead Sea Scrolls testify to their importance for at least some groups during the last centuries before the Common Era. Early Christian writers, including the author of the New Testament Epistle of Jude, referenced Enoch as if it were scripture, treating its testimony about fallen angels as reliable and true. But over time, something changed. As Jewish communities sought to define their canon of sacred scripture, to determine which texts would be considered divinely inspired and authoritative for all time, the books that contained the Elioud tradition were gradually excluded. This process was not sudden or uniform. Different communities made different choices at different times. But by the end of the first few centuries of the Common Era, a consensus had emerged among most Jewish authorities. Texts like Enoch and Jubilees, however interesting or ancient they might be, would not be included in the official canon of Hebrew scripture. The reasons for this exclusion were multiple and complex, reflecting debates about theology, authority, and the proper boundaries of sacred literature. But one significant factor was theological discomfort with the narrative of the Watchers and their offspring. The story of angels taking human wives and producing hybrid children raised troubling questions. If angels could reproduce with humans, what did that say about the nature of angels? Were they physical beings, capable of bodily functions like reproduction? Or were they purely spiritual entities? If spiritual, how could they father children? If physical, did that compromise their status as heavenly beings, as creatures fundamentally different from humans? These questions became increasingly problematic as theological thinking evolved. In the early centuries of the Common Era, Jewish and Christian thinkers were developing more refined doctrines about the nature of angels, drawing sharper distinctions between the physical and the spiritual, the material and the immaterial. The idea of angels as purely spiritual beings, incorporeal minds without bodies, gained traction, particularly among those influenced by Greek philosophical concepts. This shift in angelology created a problem for the Watchers' narrative. If angels were purely spiritual, then the entire story of their descent, their unions with human women, and the birth of hybrid offspring became not just difficult but theologically impossible. You cannot father children without a body. You cannot engage in physical reproduction if you are an immaterial spirit. Various solutions were proposed to this dilemma. Some interpreters argued that the sons of God in Genesis were not angels at all but the righteous line of Seth, and that their sin was simply marrying outside their community. Others suggested that the angels had temporarily assumed physical form for the purpose of their transgression, but this raised its own questions about how and why that would be possible. Still others acknowledged the strangeness of the passage but declined to speculate further, treating it as one of Scripture's mysteries that humans could not fully understand. But the simplest solution, and the one that eventually prevailed in most Jewish and Christian circles, was to reject the entire Enochic tradition as unreliable. If the Book of Enoch claimed that angels reproduced with humans, and if such a thing was theologically impossible, then the Book of Enoch must not be scripture. It might be an interesting ancient text, it might contain some worthwhile moral lessons, but it could not be regarded as divinely inspired and infallible. This theological shift had profound consequences for the Watcher's narrative, and by extension, for everything associated with it, including the Elioud. If the story of the Watchers was rejected, then the Nephilim could no longer be understood as angel-human hybrids. They became simply mighty men, perhaps unusually large or strong humans, but not supernatural beings. And if the Nephilim were not hybrids, then there was no need for a concept like the Elioud at all. The entire framework of multiple generations of mixed beings collapsed, becoming irrelevant to the new theological consensus. The process by which texts like Enoch fell out of favor was gradual and uneven. In some communities, they retained influence for centuries. Early Christian writers continued to reference them occasionally, even if with increasing hesitation. But over time, as the canons of both Jewish and Christian scripture became more firmly established, these texts were definitively excluded from the category of sacred writ. In the Jewish tradition, the canonization process that occurred after the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE led to a more restricted definition of Scripture. The books that would constitute the Hebrew Bible were defined, and works like Enoch and Jubilees were not among them. They might still be read by scholars or preserved in certain communities, but they were no longer taught as authoritative, no longer considered binding on belief or practice. In the Christian tradition, a similar process occurred. As the Church developed its New Testament canon and debated which Old Testament books to include, most Christian authorities followed the Jewish lead in excluding the apocryphal and pseudepigraphal works. The Book of Enoch was occasionally referenced with respect, and some Church Fathers clearly knew it well, but it did not make the final cut when the biblical canon was formally defined. The reasons extended beyond just theological concerns about angels. There were also questions about authorship. Could these texts really have been written by ancient patriarchs like Enoch, or were they much later compositions falsely attributed to ancient figures? There were concerns about their theological content more broadly. Did they promote ideas that conflicted with mainstream teaching? And there were practical considerations. With so many texts in circulation, some decisions had to be made about which ones would be regarded as definitive and which would be relegated to secondary status. As these texts were excluded from the canon, they began to disappear from common use. Without being read in synagogues or churches, without being taught to children, without being referenced in sermons and commentaries, they gradually faded from the consciousness of most believers. The manuscripts were still copied occasionally by scholars or preserved in monastic libraries, but for the average person, these texts might as well not have existed. With the fading of the texts came the fading of the ideas they contained, and with the fading of those ideas came the forgetting of figures like the Elioud. If you had asked a medieval rabbi or Christian theologian about the Elioud, most would not have known what you were talking about. The name had passed out of circulation. The concept had been left behind. The entire framework of angelic transgression and hybrid generations had been replaced by different ways of understanding the Genesis passages about the sons of God and the Nephilim. This represents a significant shift in how religious communities understood their own past. The pre-flood world, once imagined as populated by multiple species of supernatural beings, became simply a world of wicked humans who deserved judgment for their sins. The mythological complexity was stripped away, leaving a more straightforward moral narrative. Humans sinned, God sent the flood, only the righteous were saved. The Elioud survived, if they survived at all, only in what came to be called apocryphal literature. Texts that existed on the margins, preserved by scholars, occasionally referenced in obscure footnotes, but playing no role in the religious life of most communities. They became objects of academic study rather than elements of living faith, curiosities from ancient times rather than beings whose nature and fate mattered to contemporary theology. There is, however, an important exception to this pattern of rejection and forgetting: the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. While Western Christian traditions excluded books like Enoch from their canon, the Ethiopian Church preserved them as fully authoritative scripture. The Book of Enoch, in particular, was maintained in the Ethiopic language and continued to be read, studied, and regarded as divinely inspired by Ethiopian Christians. This is why, when Western scholars in the modern era began searching for complete manuscripts of Enoch, they had to turn to Ethiopia. It was the one place where the text had been continuously preserved and valued. The Ethiopian preservation of these texts is itself a fascinating story, reflecting the different paths that Christian traditions took in different parts of the world. While European Christianity, influenced by Greek and Latin theological developments, moved away from the Enochic tradition, Ethiopian Christianity maintained older patterns of thought and practice, including acceptance of texts that elsewhere had been rejected. For Ethiopian Christians, the story of the Watchers and their offspring was not a problem to be solved or a tradition to be discarded. It was part of sacred history, a testimony to the corruption that necessitated the flood, a warning about the consequences of transgression. The Elioud, within this tradition, never entirely disappeared. They remained part of the story, even if they were not often discussed or emphasized. But Ethiopian Christianity, for all its importance in preserving these texts, was geographically and culturally distant from the centers of Christian power and scholarship that dominated European and Middle Eastern Christianity. Its canon was not the canon that shaped Western theology or influenced the Protestant Reformation or informed Catholic doctrine. For most of Christian history, what Ethiopian Christians believed about Enoch and the Elioud had little impact on what Christians elsewhere believed. The result was that the Elioud fell into a kind of double obscurity, excluded from the canon in most traditions, and even where the texts were preserved, rarely discussed or emphasized. They became, in effect, forgotten beings, mentioned in books that most people never read, part of traditions that most communities had left behind. It is worth pausing to consider what was lost in this process of rejection and forgetting. Whether or not one believes that the Watcher's narrative describes actual historical events, it represented a particular way of thinking about the problem of evil, about the origin of corruption, about the relationship between different orders of being. It took seriously the idea that the world had been fundamentally damaged by ancient transgressions, that violence and wickedness were not just human failings but had deeper, more complex roots. It offered a mythology rich with imaginative power, capable of generating further stories and interpretations. When this mythology was set aside, something was lost. Not necessarily something true in a literal sense, but something meaningful, something that had helped people make sense of their experience of a world that often seemed corrupted and broken. The Elioud, as part of this mythology, carried a particular weight. They represented the persistence of corruption across generations, the way ancient sins propagate forward in time, affecting beings who never chose the original transgression. In the modern era, interest in these texts has revived, at least among scholars and those fascinated by ancient mythology. The discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls brought renewed attention to books like Enoch and Jubilees. Academic study has made them more accessible than they have been in centuries. Popular books and media sometimes reference the Nephilim and the Watchers, though the Elioud remain obscure even in these treatments. But for most people, even today, these are not living traditions. They are historical curiosities, interesting perhaps, but not part of the religious or cultural framework through which we understand the world. The Elioud have not been restored to prominence by scholarly attention. They remain what the process of canonization made them: forgotten beings, excluded from the story, preserved only in texts that most will never read. This is the fate that befalls ideas and traditions when communities decide they no longer serve. The Elioud were not destroyed by the flood alone, they were forgotten by the very traditions that once preserved their memory, excluded by the theological developments that made their existence problematic, left behind as religious thought moved in different directions. They survive now only as traces, as evidence of roads not taken, as reminders that what we remember and what we forget are not always matters of truth or importance, but often simply matters of choice. When ancient traditions are forgotten by mainstream culture, something curious often happens. The vacuum left by their absence becomes filled with new interpretations, modern retellings, creative elaborations that bear little resemblance to the original sources. Obscure figures from old texts are discovered by new generations and reimagined according to contemporary fascinations and fears. What was once straightforward, if strange, becomes layered with meanings the ancients never intended. This has happened to the Elioud. In recent decades, as interest in biblical apocrypha and ancient mythology has grown through popular books, films, and online communities, the Nephilim have achieved a kind of cultural prominence they never had in centuries past. And in the wake of this renewed attention to the Nephilim, some have also encountered the Elioud and begun to weave new stories about them. Stories that sound compelling, that seem to connect ancient mysteries to modern concerns, but that have little basis in the actual ancient sources. It is worth taking time to carefully examine what the Elioud were not, according to the texts that actually mention them, so that we can distinguish between ancient tradition and modern invention. Let us begin with one of the most common contemporary associations, the connection between the Elioud and creatures of horror like vampires or werewolves. This connection simply does not exist in the ancient sources. The texts that mention the Elioud, primarily the Book of Enoch and the Book of Jubilees, describe them as giants, as hybrid beings descended from the Nephilim, as participants in the violence and corruption of the antediluvian world. But nowhere in these texts do we find descriptions of the Elioud drinking blood, transforming into animals, or displaying any of the characteristics associated with the vampire or werewolf myths that developed much later in European folklore. The vampire, as a concept, evolved primarily in Eastern European traditions during the medieval and early modern periods. The specific image we have today, an immortal being that drinks blood to sustain itself, that fears sunlight and religious symbols, that can transform into a bat, is largely a product of 18th and 19th century literature and folklore. The werewolf tradition has somewhat older roots, appearing in various forms in Greek and Roman sources, but the specific mythology of humans who transform into wolves under certain conditions is also distinct from anything described about the Elioud. These are entirely separate mythological traditions, arising in different times and places, reflecting different cultural anxieties and imaginative concerns. To retroactively connect the Elioud to vampires or werewolves is to impose modern monster mythology onto ancient texts that knew nothing of such creatures. It is a creative act of synthesis, not a discovery of hidden connections. The same applies to descriptions of the Elioud as immortal beings. The ancient texts do not present the Elioud as immortal. They are described as powerful, as larger and stronger than ordinary humans, but they are not portrayed as beings who cannot die. In fact, the entire Enochic tradition emphasizes that the hybrid offspring of the Watchers were mortal, that they could be killed, and that they would die in the flood. Their mortality was part of what made them problematic. They had the power of angels but the lifespan of humans, creating beings who knew they would die and therefore acted with a kind of desperate violence, trying to seize and consume as much as possible in the limited time they had. There are no ancient sources that describe the Elioud living forever, passing through the centuries unchanged, existing in secret among human populations across millennia. The tradition is clear: they lived before the flood, and they perished in the flood. Their story has an ending. Similarly, there are no ancient descriptions of the Elioud as shapeshifters. The ability to change form, to appear as one thing and then transform into another, is attributed to various beings in different mythological traditions. Some stories about demons or spirits include shape-shifting abilities. But the Elioud are not described this way in the sources that mention them. They are consistently portrayed as giants, as beings with a fixed physical form, larger than humans, stronger than humans, but not capable of changing their appearance or transforming into animals or other creatures. When we read in modern sources that the Elioud were shapeshifters, we are reading an interpretation that has been layered onto the ancient texts, not something the texts themselves actually say. This may reflect an attempt to connect the Elioud to other mythological beings who do possess such abilities, or it may be an effort to make them seem more mysterious and supernatural. But it is not grounded in the documentary evidence. The characterization of the Elioud as nocturnal beings, creatures of the night who avoid daylight, is another modern addition. There is nothing in the ancient texts that suggests the Elioud had any particular relationship with darkness or night. They are not described as being harmed by sunlight, as hiding during the day, or as being more active or powerful after dark. These associations come from vampire mythology and from a general modern tendency to associate supernatural or monstrous beings with nighttime and shadow. But the Elioud of the ancient texts walked the earth during the day just as during the night. They were not creatures of darkness in any special sense beyond their participation in moral wickedness. Perhaps most significantly, we must address claims about Elioud bloodlines surviving past the flood. This is where modern speculation becomes most divorced from ancient tradition. The entire point of the flood narrative, in both Genesis and in the expanded accounts in texts like Enoch and Jubilees, is that the flood destroyed the corrupt world and all its inhabitants except for Noah and his family. The Nephilim died. The Elioud died. The humans who had become wicked died. Everything that breathed and was not in the ark perished under the waters. No ancient text traces Elioud bloodlines past the flood. There are no genealogies showing their descendants living in the post-Diluvian world. There are no stories of Elioud survivors hiding in mountains or being preserved through some special means. The tradition is emphatic. They ended. The world began again without them. And yet, in modern conspiracy theories and speculative histories, we frequently encounter claims that the Elioud bloodline survived, that certain families or groups today carry this ancient hybrid inheritance, that secret societies or elite classes are actually descended from these antediluvian beings. These claims are entirely modern inventions. They arise not from careful reading of ancient texts but from a contemporary fascination with secret knowledge, hidden bloodlines, and the idea that powerful elites possess some quality that separates them from ordinary humanity. The Elioud, as obscure figures from forgotten texts, become convenient vessels for such speculation precisely because so few people know what the ancient sources actually say about them. The less familiar a tradition is, the easier it becomes to claim that it says something it does not. The appeal of such theories is understandable. There is something satisfying about the idea that ancient mysteries connect to present realities, that the struggles of today have roots in cosmic dramas from the distant past. The notion that certain families carry supernatural bloodlines offers an explanation for power and privilege that goes beyond economics and politics. It provides a narrative where the world's complexities reduce to a simple story of ordinary humans versus those with tainted ancestry. But these narratives, however compelling they might be as modern mythology, have nothing to do with what the ancient texts actually say. They are contemporary creations, reflecting contemporary concerns, projected backward onto ancient figures who have been emptied of their original meaning and refilled with new significance. When we trace the origin of these modern claims, we typically find not ancient manuscripts but 20th and 21st century books, websites, and videos, sources that cite other modern sources rather than returning to the primary texts. The chain of reference goes back not to Enoch or Jubilees or the Dead Sea Scrolls, but to someone's creative interpretation, someone's speculative connection, someone's decision to link disparate ideas together in a way that seems meaningful but lacks documentary support. This is not to say that people who make such claims are necessarily acting in bad faith. Many genuinely believe what they are saying, having encountered these ideas in sources they trust and not having the specialized knowledge needed to verify them against ancient texts. The problem is not malicious invention but the telephone game effect, ideas passing from person to person, changing slightly each time, accumulating details and connections that were never present in the original, until what emerges bears little resemblance to where it began. The internet has accelerated this process dramatically. Information and misinformation spread with equal ease. A claim made in one blog post or video gets repeated by dozens of others, each repetition lending it an aura of credibility, until people encounter it so frequently that they assume it must be true. The Elioud, obscure enough that most people have never heard of them, become whatever any given writer wants them to be, with few readers having the knowledge to push back or correct the record. We must also consider the question of why such modern myths arise around figures like the Elioud in the first place. Part of it is simple creativity, the human impulse to tell stories, to make connections, to imagine possibilities. Ancient fragments invite completion. Obscure references invite elaboration. There is nothing inherently wrong with creative interpretation or with using ancient motifs as starting points for new narratives. The problem arises only when such creativity is presented as discovery, when modern invention is claimed to be ancient truth. But there is also something else at work, a contemporary hunger for hidden knowledge, for secret histories, for explanations that go beneath the surface of official narratives. We live in an age of information overload, where trust in traditional authorities has eroded, where people increasingly believe that the real truth is being concealed by those in power. In such an environment, Obscure ancient texts become attractive precisely because they exist outside mainstream religious and academic institutions. They seem to offer access to knowledge that has been suppressed or forgotten, to truths that the establishment does not want you to know. The Elioud fit perfectly into this framework. They exist in texts that were excluded from the biblical canon, that most people have never read, that seem to contain mysteries not taught in churches or schools. The fact that they faded from memory makes them seem like forbidden knowledge, rather than simply knowledge that theological developments rendered irrelevant. And once they are framed as forbidden knowledge, it becomes easy to attach all sorts of additional claims to them. Claims about their survival, their influence, their connection to contemporary power structures. None of this makes the claims true. It only explains why they appeal to certain audiences and why they spread despite lack of evidence. If we return to the actual ancient sources and read them carefully, without the overlay of modern speculation, we find beings far simpler and less dramatic than the contemporary myths suggest. The Elioud were giants, descendants of the Nephilim, part of the corrupted antediluvian world. They were powerful and violent. They contributed to the wickedness that necessitated the flood, and they perished when the waters rose, along with everything else that was not preserved in the ark. That is what the texts say. Everything else, the vampirism, the immortality, the shape-shifting, the survival past the flood, the connection to modern bloodlines, is addition, interpretation, speculation built on speculation, modern mythology masquerading as ancient wisdom. This does not make the Elioud less interesting. If anything, understanding what they actually were according to ancient traditions makes them more interesting, because it roots them in a specific historical and cultural context, in real texts written by real people grappling with questions about evil and corruption and divine judgment. The ancient Elioud, properly understood, tell us something about how certain Jewish communities in the Second Temple period thought about their world and its problems. The modern invented Elioud, by contrast, tell us only about contemporary anxieties and fascinations. There is value in studying both, the ancient traditions in their original context, and the modern reinterpretations as phenomena in their own right. But we must not confuse the two. We must not treat modern speculation as if it were ancient testimony. We must maintain the distinction between what the texts actually say and what later readers have projected onto them. The Elioud were not vampires. They were not werewolves. They were not immortal or shape-shifting or particularly associated with darkness. Their bloodlines did not survive the flood to influence modern elites. These are comfortable fictions, modern myths built around ancient names, creative interpretations that have drifted far from their source. What the Elioud were, according to the traditions that remembered them, was simpler and in its own way more tragic. They were the last generation of hybrid beings before the flood, descendants of a transgression they did not commit, participants in a corruption they inherited, beings whose existence was incompatible with the world's continuation, swept away by waters that left no trace of them behind, except words in texts that most would never read, names that most would never hear, memories. Preserved in obscurity, waiting across centuries to be discovered, and too often misunderstood. There is a second life that some ancient things achieve, a resurrection of sorts, though not in the form they originally possessed. After centuries of obscurity, after being forgotten by the traditions that created them, certain names and concepts are discovered anew, not by scholars seeking historical accuracy, but by storytellers seeking raw material, by artists looking for inspiration, by imaginations drawn to the mysterious and half-remembered. The Elioud have experienced this resurrection. In the digital age, as ancient texts become more accessible through online archives and translations, as interest in mythology and the esoteric spreads through internet communities, the Elioud have begun to reappear. Not in religious teaching or theological discourse, where they remain as obscure as ever, but in fiction, in games, in forums and fan wikis, in the sprawling collaborative mythology making that characterizes contemporary popular culture. This new life the Elioud are living is very different from their ancient existence. They are no longer theological problems to be resolved or rejected. They are no longer warnings about corruption and divine judgment. They have become something more flexible, more adaptable, symbols that can be shaped and reshaped according to whatever purpose the storyteller has in mind. In fantasy fiction, the Elioud sometimes appear as a race of beings with mixed heritage, neither fully human nor fully divine, struggling with questions of identity and belonging. Authors who discover the name in their research into biblical apocrypha find it useful precisely because it is obscure. It carries the weight of ancient authority without the baggage of extensive established lore. Unlike angels or demons, which come with centuries of accumulated tradition and expectation, the Elioud can be almost anything a writer needs them to be. Some stories portray them as tragic figures, cursed by their ancestry, trying to find a place in a world that has no category for what they are. This interpretation draws on the ancient tradition's emphasis on the Elioud as later generations, diluted in power but still marked by their hybrid nature. These fictional Elioud often grapple with questions of responsibility. Are they accountable for sins committed by ancestors long dead? Can they escape the destiny their bloodline seems to impose? These are modern concerns, questions about inherited guilt and the possibility of redemption, but they find resonance in the ancient story of beings born into a corrupted world. Other stories take a different approach, portraying the Elioud as powerful beings who survived the flood through secret means and now operate in hidden ways within human society. These narratives ignore the ancient tradition's clear statement that the Elioud perished, but they tap into contemporary fascinations with secret histories and hidden powers. In these tales, the Elioud become part of the furniture of urban fantasy and supernatural thriller genres, ancient beings with agendas of their own, manipulating events from the shadows, possessing knowledge and abilities that modern humans have forgotten. In gaming, tabletop role-playing games, video games, card games, the Elioud have found perhaps their most diverse array of interpretations. Game designers value flexibility above historical accuracy, and the obscurity of the Elioud makes them ideal for creative adaptation. One game might present them as a playable character race with specific abilities and limitations. Another might use them as antagonists, representing an ancient threat returning to threaten the world. Yet another might incorporate them into complex cosmologies where multiple types of hybrid beings exist in hierarchical relationships. These gaming interpretations often emphasize the power aspect of the Elioud tradition while downplaying the moral corruption. Players generally want to feel powerful when playing as unusual races, and being descended from angels and giants certainly provides that. The violence that characterized the Elioud in ancient texts becomes combat prowess in game terms, a mechanical advantage rather than a moral failing. The tragedy of their fate becomes backstory flavor rather than central theme. Online lore communities, wikis devoted to cataloging mythological beings, forums where people discuss and debate ancient traditions, social media groups focused on the esoteric, have also embraced the Elioud, though in ways that often blur the line between scholarship and speculation. These communities value obscurity as a form of cultural capital. Knowing about the Elioud, being able to cite the Book of Enoch or mention the Dead Sea Scrolls, marks one as someone who has gone deeper than surface-level mythology, who has done the research that most people have not. But the information circulating in these communities is uneven in quality. Accurate summaries of what the ancient texts actually say exist alongside wild speculation and modern invention. The same discussion thread might contain both careful citations of primary sources and claims that have no basis in any ancient text. For participants without specialized knowledge, it can be difficult to distinguish between the two, to know which claims are grounded in documentary evidence and which are creative elaboration. This mixing of fact and fiction, of ancient tradition and modern invention, is characteristic of how mythology functions in the contemporary world. We no longer have a unified, authoritative tradition passed down through established institutions. Instead, we have a kind of democratized mythology making, where anyone with internet access can contribute to the evolving story, where ideas spread horizontally through networks rather than vertically through hierarchies of authority. The Elioud have become one small part of this larger phenomenon, a piece of genuine ancient tradition that has been picked up, examined, set down, picked up again by someone else, transformed, combined with other ideas, passed along, transformed again, until it exists in multiple versions simultaneously, each claiming in its own way to represent the real story. What drives this process of reimagining? Partly, it is simply the creative impulse that has always led humans to tell stories, to take existing elements and recombine them in new ways. The Elioud provide an intriguing starting point, a mysterious name, a fragmentary tradition, a connection to the famous Nephilim. Writers and artists see potential in that material, see ways to develop it, to fill in the gaps the ancient texts left empty. But there is something else as well, the appeal of the forgotten, the allure of the obscure. In an age of information saturation, when so much is known and documented and readily available, there is a particular attraction to things that exist at the margins, that require effort to discover, that seem to offer access to knowledge not widely shared. The Elioud are obscure enough to feel like a discovery when someone first encounters them. They exist in texts that most people have never read, represent traditions that mainstream religion left behind. This gives them a kind of mystique, a sense that knowing about them means knowing something special, something hidden. This appeal of hidden knowledge explains why the Elioud appear more often in esoteric and alternative contexts than in mainstream ones. They fit naturally into narratives about secret histories, about truths concealed by established authorities, about ancient wisdom that modernity has forgotten. The fact that they were excluded from the biblical canon makes them seem like forbidden knowledge, rather than simply knowledge that a particular canonization process did not include. There is irony in this, of course. The ancient texts that mention the Elioud were not hidden. They circulated openly in the communities that valued them, were copied and read and studied without secrecy. They were excluded from the canon for theological reasons, not suppressed to keep dangerous truths from the public. But the passage of time has transformed their obscurity into something that feels like concealment, their marginal status into something that feels like prohibition. The Elioud have also become symbolic in a more abstract sense. They represent the vast amount of ancient tradition that exists beyond the familiar stories, the enormous body of literature and belief that flourished in the past and then faded away. For every text that survived and remained influential, how many others were written and then lost? For every figure we remember, how many were forgotten? The Elioud stand as representatives of all that forgotten material, a reminder that what we know about the ancient world is only a small fraction of what once existed. This symbolic dimension gives discussions of the Elioud a particular quality. They become an opportunity to reflect on loss and preservation, on what gets remembered and what gets forgotten, on how arbitrary those processes sometimes are. The Elioud were not less interesting or less meaningful than other figures who remained prominent. They simply ended up on the wrong side of various historical and theological developments. Their obscurity is not a measure of their insignificance, but of the contingent nature of cultural memory. In modern reimaginings, the Elioud often carry this metatextual weight. They are not just characters in stories but symbols of forgotten things, of knowledge that exists at the margins, of the incompleteness of official narratives. Writers and artists use them to gesture toward everything that lies beyond the well-known, to suggest depths that mainstream culture does not acknowledge. This is a long way from what the ancient texts actually said about them. The original tradition portrayed the Elioud as dangerous beings whose violence contributed to the corruption that necessitated the flood. They were not symbols but entities within a cosmological framework, part of an explanation for why the world had gone wrong and why such drastic divine action had become necessary. They served a specific theological purpose in the communities that told their story. But meanings change over time. Symbols get reinterpreted. Ancient figures get pressed into service for new purposes. This is not a new phenomenon, it has always happened. The Greek and Roman gods meant something different to medieval allegorists than they did to their original worshippers. Biblical figures have been reimagined countless times to serve different theological or artistic purposes. The process by which the Elioud are being reimagined today is part of a much longer pattern of how cultures relate to their inherited traditions. What makes the contemporary situation distinctive is the speed and diversity of reinterpretation. In the past, a figure like the Elioud might have been reimagined once every few centuries as some writer or theologian encountered the texts and decided to do something new with them. Now, new interpretations appear constantly. A novel published this year, a game released next month, a post on a forum tomorrow. The Elioud exists simultaneously in dozens of versions, each shaped by different creative visions, each claiming in its own way to engage with the ancient tradition. Some of these reimaginings are thoughtful and carefully researched, representing genuine attempts to grapple with what the ancient texts actually said while adapting it for modern audiences. Others are superficial, using the name without much attention to its origins or original meaning. Most fall somewhere in between, respectful of the tradition but not bound by it, drawing inspiration from the ancient sources while feeling free to depart from them when the story requires it. There is no central authority regulating these interpretations, no institution empowered to declare which versions are legitimate and which are not. The Elioud belong, in a sense, to everyone who encounters them, available to be shaped according to whatever purposes seem appropriate or interesting. This democratization of interpretation has both virtues and drawbacks. It allows for creativity and innovation, for perspectives that institutional authorities might never have permitted. But it also allows for distortion and misinformation, for the spreading of ideas that have no basis in actual ancient sources. The result is a kind of chaos of interpretation, a proliferation of Eliouds, the ancient Elioud of the texts, the invented Elioud of conspiracy theories, the fictional Elioud of novels and games, the symbolic Elioud of esoteric discourse. All of these exist simultaneously, competing for attention, sometimes overlapping, sometimes contradicting each other, creating a landscape of interpretation that is rich but confusing, creative but unreliable. For someone encountering the Elioud for the first time in this environment, it can be difficult to know where to begin, which version to trust, how to distinguish between ancient tradition and modern invention. The name itself has become a kind of test. Do you know what it means? Can you trace it to its sources? Or will you accept whatever interpretation you first encounter, assuming it represents the ancient truth? This is the paradox of the Elioud's resurrection. They have been brought back from obscurity, but in the process they have been transformed into something quite different from what they were. They have achieved a kind of cultural presence they never had in ancient times, appearing in more contexts and reaching more people than they did when they were part of living religious traditions. But this presence comes at the cost of clarity and coherence. The Elioud exists now as a name that can mean almost anything, attached to an ancient tradition that most people have not read and cannot verify. Perhaps this is inevitable for figures recovered from such extreme obscurity. When a tradition has been broken for so long, when texts have been unread for so many centuries, their reappearance in a very different cultural context necessarily involves transformation. The Elioud cannot simply return as they were. The world that gave them meaning no longer exists. They must be reimagined for new audiences with new concerns, translated not just linguistically but culturally, made relevant to people who do not share the theological assumptions of Second Temple Judaism or the cosmological frameworks of ancient apocalyptic thought. In this reimagining, something is certainly lost: the specific historical and cultural context, the particular meanings they carried for the communities that first told their stories. But something is also gained: new life, new relevance, new possibilities for meaning. The Elioud have become part of contemporary mythology, part of the ongoing human project of storytelling and meaning-making. They exist now in that curious space between ancient and modern, between obscure tradition and popular culture, between forgotten history and living imagination. They are what they always were, beings from ancient texts, briefly mentioned and barely described. But they are also what we make them: symbols and characters, mysteries and inspirations, names waiting to be filled with meaning. The silence left by ancient texts, the gaps in the tradition, the questions that the fragments cannot answer, these have become invitations to creativity, spaces where imagination can work. The Elioud, because they were described so briefly, because so little was said about them, offer maximum freedom for reinterpretation. They are blank enough to be filled with whatever meanings seem necessary or interesting. And so they live again, not as they were but as we imagine them. The Elioud reimagined, reshaped, reborn in stories and games and speculations, carrying their ancient name forward into a future their original authors could never have envisioned, forever changed by the long sleep of forgetting and the strange awakening of rediscovery, existing now more as possibility than as fixed tradition, more as question than as answer, a forgotten name that has become, in our time, a canvas for the human need to wonder, to create, to fill the silence with meaning.